Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Marketing Live for Thursday, March 22nd, 2018. I'm Rob Zinkin, your host. I serve as Associate Vice President for Marketing at Indiana University. Today, we'll help you leverage the art of persuasive storytelling. First, though, a reminder that Marketing Live is part of the Higher Ed Live network. Our episodes offer you direct access to the best and brightest minds in education and beyond. You can be a part of our live broadcast today with your comments and your questions. Please join the conversation using the hashtag HigherEdLive on Twitter. All of our episodes are free and easy to access in the video archives at higheredlive.com, or take Higher Ed Live with you on the go by subscribing to the podcast. I'm driving across the state this afternoon to one of our other campuses and planning to check out a past episode of Admissions Live that was recorded a bit ago on what admitted students want. Higher Ed Live is produced by M. Stoner, a digital-first agency committed to tailored solutions that drive real results. We know you've wondered what prospective teams are thinking when they receive and read, or perhaps ignore, your institution's recruitment marketing. In partnership with NRCCUA, the Myth-Busting Enrollment Marketing Research uncovers the best marketing channels and communication preferences that have the biggest influence on prospective teams' perception of your institution. The white paper is available for on-demand download. Get your copy today and identify what encourages prospective teams to apply to your college or university. We'll be tweeting out a link shortly. Thanks also to Omni Update as the #1 resource for students and parents to research colleges. Your website deserves the #1 web content management system for higher ed. Omni Update's OU Campus Web CMS is built specifically for higher ed. It has the most higher ed users, is extremely easy to use, and is backed by award-winning support. Check it out at omniupdate.com. I am delighted to welcome today's guest, Esther Choy. Esther is president and chief story facilitator of Leadership Story Lab, which she founded in 2010. She's author of the book, Let the Story Do the Work, The Art of Storytelling for Business Success, which is fantastic. You should all check it out. Esther's quite familiar with our world of higher ed, having served as an admissions officer and teaching leadership, and we'll certainly get into some of those experiences during our discussion today. So Esther, so nice to meet you and welcome to the broadcast.
So nice to meet you too. Thank you so much for having me on.
And I'm excited to hear, of course, all of your insights on storytelling. And you have a fascinating story yourself. So I'll ask if you could go a little deeper than that brief bio that I just provided and share something that has been an integral part of your own professional story. So is there anything specific that has had a lasting impact on you?
I would like to say that I entered higher ed, my undergraduate, in 1992. And since then, I had never left. Not physically still enrolled as a student. I fell in love with student affairs, had a master's degree in student affairs, worked in various capacity of student affairs. And then unbeknownst to me, I thought I would follow more of a path that you have, eventually getting my PhD. But then I made an unexpected 90-degree turn and did go back to school, but got my MBA. And I wish I could say when I applied for my MBA and my essays, one day I would grow up and write a book and teach storytelling to executives. None of that made it to my essays, but that's where I am today. But all of it has, I think I've owned it to my training and experience and years working in various capacity at higher ed. So I'm super excited. Actually, I feel like this is a minor homecoming for me. To be speaking with colleagues in my home industry.
Yes, that's great. Welcome home. And your higher ed experience is really interesting. And I want to hone in on specifically on your admissions work when you served as an admissions officer at the Booth School of Business at the University of Chicago. And how did your experiences there, of course, a top tier business school, how did those experiences help to frame your outlook on the power of story?
Yeah, that is usually the starting point when people ask me, so how did you get into this? This is such a niche, unique, new line of work. And it did begin at Booth. But I would say that the contrast was set before Booth. So at Booth, I was part of a gatekeeping team. Just like any admissions, you're putting a class together at a top-tier institutions. We had the privilege of having far more well-qualified applicants there are seats for. So that was the selection process. But I am extremely fortunate to have the opposite point of view prior to Booth, because I was in student retention, I was in academic advising, and then I was also in leadership development, ironically at Northwestern universities. And so all these roles prepare me to develop students, to be student advocates, to believe in them. And then all of a sudden, I jumped the fence. I sat on the other side. I asked mainly the questions of, why are you so special that you think you deserve a seat over thousands, literally thousands of other students who are just, at least on paper, look as qualified, if not more qualified than you, right? So having that contrast viewpoints helped me understand that, well, you know, working hard, being very smart, and expand and enrich your resume as much as you possibly could. It's a starting point. It's a great starting point, but that's not enough at the end of the day. It's about the stories that you tell, about connecting the data points in ways that resonate with decision makers. That's what set apart the ones who eventually are admitted versus the one who are denied, but they are just as qualified.
And did you see, and I ask with a special interest, as I mentioned before we started, having my oldest son being high school junior age and beginning that process as we look at options for higher education. And what did you tend to see typically, though? Is it a matter of using that essay to simply restate what you might see in terms of a list of accomplishments, or because I guess, and this gets to the next question of a point of yours that really resonates, that you don't have to be a superhero to tell a great story. You don't have to have an epic story to tell a good story. So how did you see maybe things that wouldn't come across as, wow, I had this amazing experience or amazing journey, but perhaps more of an everyday thing that could turn into a compelling narrative?
Exactly. And I'm so glad you asked a question, because I try to remind, and with the risk of sound like a broken record, that you don't have to be a superhero to tell great stories. In fact, you don't even have to be a natural born good storytellers, creative, to tell great stories. It's the ability, rather, to spot story potentials and refine it and tell it in ways that resonate with decision makers. So if you are somebody who have eradicated malaria, good for you, good for humankind, but so few of us have that experience. But it doesn't mean that we're doomed, because a lot of what makes students like your son stand out is not just showcasing their credentials, their accomplishments, but it's this whole idea of showcasing their character. Okay, and I was looking down, because as you're asking the questions, I'm reminded of this graph. It's very primitive, so I ask you for your forgiveness, but I think the impact is no less obvious. So here, you can see concentric circles, 3 of them. On the outer ring is credentials, the inner ring is competence, and in the center is character. Okay. And credentials, in the case of your sons or any other high school rising seniors, college application, all college applicants, their GPA, where they went to school, maybe their national merit scholars, ACT scores, all of that, right? Perhaps a competence is that I'm a collegiate athlete. My specialties is running, or that I have led multiple clubs. Presidents of student body, and also played 5 musical instruments, and I have served abroad, all of that. Mm-hmm. They're rather readily available, right? Because it's part of the data input. What's very rare in the essays and for some colleges in interviews is the showcasing of characters. And yet, if you think about the emotional response and the emotional impact on the audience, it has an inverse relationship with how abundantly available informations are of credentials and competence, but very, very, very few people pay attention to how do I illustrate my characters. Because at Booth, at the time when we did give denied feedback, we saw so many highly qualified applicants who were denied. They have the credentials, they have the competence, but they didn't showcase the fit. And it's in the characters of the applicants that really showcase what the fit really means. It's a real big missed opportunity here.
Great, and this sparks a lot of sub-questions, one of which is, Esther, back to your point about spotting story potential. And I know one of the things that you mentioned in the book is the importance of asking questions and how essential that is to finding great stories. So any specific advice on how to ask better questions, how we can get better at asking good questions, and even to go back to the previous point about everyday opportunities for story? Why do you think we overlook some of those opportunities when really stories are abundant and potentially all around us?
Yeah, so along with the book, I did a tour, and then I developed this workshop to complement the book tour. Is a way for people to mine story ideas. And I have to say, of all the workshops I've had 24 of topics. This is the most popular because I think people are delighted by, I had no idea this is interesting, that you would even ask. And so I have these 17 questions that I have people ask of each other's. And they seem like random questions, collections of questions. There are questions like, if you can interview anyone not famous, who would it be and why? And there are questions like, what do you typically do on a Saturday morning? And then there are questions like, if you can double any one particular area in your home, what would it be and why? And then there are questions that talked about, what are some things that you spend way too much on? Could be money, could be time, could be effort, but have no regrets. Okay, so 17 of these. I have a lot more, but I can only fit so much on one page. And mining story ideas is what dictated what kind of questions made it to my list of 17s. So they are questions that get beyond the service of what you do, where you live, where do you study, what do you study, so on and so forth, and get immediately beyond that. The other is it gets to what people care about when nobody's looking or paying attention. And the last criterion is what changed. So define a period So there's a questions on completes the sentence for me. When I ask myself, my 10 years younger self, I am most afraid of, and then fill in the blank. Okay, so these type of questions gets to what's different about you over this period of time. Okay, and then and so the rest of the process has to do with then, you know, you've mined and then you fish for these ideas and then you took them through a refining process. But the beginning is important, right? You had to start with a good material. And so if you think about, excuse me, what change, what do you care about, and what's beyond the surface? Excuse me, choke me up even now. That's how you mine for these great ideas.
Those are terrific insights and something I think that can get us all thinking and perhaps even thinking in a different way as we dig into storytelling. And I even want to go back, Esther, to your point with the college essay example. And I appreciated your point about trying to create an emotional connection. And that reinforces the point that we're not just telling stories or using story for the sake of telling a story, that stories have a purpose, that they're strategic, and that, as you said, we want to create an emotional connection with our audience. We want to motivate our audience to act. So if our ultimate goal is to influence others to take an action, or we want to create some change through our audience, is it a matter of thinking about story in a different way than we might normally think about it?
Yeah, I think for those of us in higher ed, there is a common element of being mission driven, right? Because there's a very higher purpose to be in higher ed. And the danger of that is that we can get into the weeds very quickly. And then we lose sight of, why are we even talking about this, right? What is the purpose? How would it resonate with our audience, or will it at all? And ultimately, what do we hope that they will do with the stories, right? And so it's higher ed, it's nonprofit, it's really anyone who's mission driven, who care about what they do. There's a tendency to go right into the weeds. Oh, let me tell you. And even I am at fault of that often, because if you ask me about storytelling, boy, do I have so much to say. You have an hour. That's awesome. This is like playtime. Let me take you right into it. And then often I will forget, well, why are we talking about story? I love it, but not everybody does. Why should they care? And so to remember the ultimate purpose, why we're telling a story, and what do we hope people will do with it, should be the engine. And then we can place other cards behind the engine.
You've identified, I think, a key thing in our sector, because that's certainly a challenge when it comes to higher ed storytelling, that our institutions do so much: education, research, service. The scope of our missions is immense. So we want to tell all the things, and it can be really challenging, and even more challenging than one might expect, to make the complex clear. Mm-hmm. And so while we have so many stories and our institutions, being mission driven, do such great work, it can easily get cluttered, and so that the key theme from a story may evade the audience.
Yes. And so I encourage in the book, and as well as in my speaking and training coaching, that think about the beginning and the end, and then fill in the middle. The beginning is how you attract people's attention and how you hook their curiosity. And then forget the middle for now, but go right to the end. Because the end is where we think about, well, what would their takeaway be? What do you hope they will do? And once you have that set, You have your beginning, you have your end. Then the middle is a matter of filling in that makes it flow and logical and coherent and riveting. But you can't create a middle without knowing where you begin and where you end.
And do you have, Esther, a specific recommendation in terms of structuring a story as you talk about the hook and your three-part structure? So if you could elaborate that on that a little bit, and perhaps that second act. So we know the beginning and the end, but what typically does come in that middle?
Sure. Let me just quickly go over what I discouraged people to do. That is, begin with, let me tell you a story. Try not to do that. Try not to do something like say what you're going to say it, and then say what you just said. And then also try not to give it away completely in the beginning, and then backfill it with, oh, here's why the conclusion is this. Okay. Instead, the 3-act consists of setting a scene and then a hook. There's all there is to it. The beginning is the shortest part of the story, right? So, and the scene is nothing more than time and location. Okay. Because when you can bring people into your scene and you don't necessarily tell them why, what it activates right away is their imagination. I think it was actually an article many years ago in the Chronicle of Higher Ed. The title is called The Pleasure of Imagination. And then the writer, the author, cited a research about how on average American spend up to 4 hours on story-based activities, right? Because when we're not being paid, when nobody's watching, what we're attracted to are the opportunities for us to activate our imaginations, right? So you set the scene, you hook the imaginations, and then you bring them onto the journey, right? That typically includes other characters other than the main characters, the additional setbacks, perhaps surprises, and then leading to a climax, which is the end point of Act 2. And then towards the end where you have the final resolutions, and then the takeaway. The takeaway is the most important part that people tend to forget that, well, they listen to this presentation or they read this marketing material. Of course, they'll come to the same conclusions. But oftentimes people are surprised the range and variety of how different interpretations people can have. So we have to be very explicit about our conclusion. So those are the 3 main parts of stories.
And we know the hook is so important too, with having to get the audience's attention, having to get them engaged right off the bat. And do you have specific strategies or tactics to help to have an effective hook at the beginning?
Yes, I'm so glad you asked. I spend a lot of time on developing an effective hook, even though the beginning is the shortest part of the story, because if you don't hook their attention right away, you lose them forever. And so, again, no need to be creative. If you are, it's great. If you're not, then remember the 3 C's, and that is conflict, contrast, or contradictions. Okay, so these are 3 systematic ways to think about how to create a hook. Conflict is nothing more than 2 opposing forces going at each other. It does not need to be epic. Nobody needs to die or hurt, right? It's just 2 opposing forces. Contrast is putting 2 opposite qualities right next to each other. Okay. And then contradiction is contradicting what your audience is expecting. Okay. That requires us knowing a little bit, at least a little bit about, well, what do our audience already know? but that may not be on the right path. And then place it in the beginning of the story and contradict them first.
And one takeaway that I have from this, as you articulated that point, and even going back to the scene itself and getting the audience to imagine it or see themselves in that, is you're very focused on the audience, and you're thinking of this from the audience's perspective. And that's something obviously that you emphasize in the book, the importance of truly understanding your audience. So do you have recommendations there in terms of what can we do to better understand our audience, to understand them inside and out, to try to get inside their heads and get out of our own point of view and see from their point of view, which sometimes can be easier said than done?
It is really easy said than done. The whole idea of being cursed by our knowledge, right? Because we know a lot about institutions, we care especially, but we're cursed by this knowledge because the idea that once we know something, it's nearly impossible for us to imagine what it's like not to know. So it's almost like once you're aware of something, then you're forever lost with that tribe. You're disconnected with them. But there are remedies, of course, and it's something that I talk about in the book that, for example, customer research, student research, focus group, all of that is helpful, right? And then we want to continue to rely on the insights. Suppose you don't have time or budget or both. A really effective, simple, relatively cost-free way to think about how do we understand our audience is, again, piece of paper, blank. And then all you have to do is draw a line in the middle. Okay. On the left-hand side, you write down no. And the other side, you write down, whoops. Don't know. Okay. In this column, you write down everything that your audience know. Could be for your institutions, could be for athletic program, for particular schools, and everything that they don't know. Okay. May not be, once you fill it out, you may not be able to make use of everything, but it's incredibly effective to place yourself in their shoes and almost place yourself in their head and to see the world as the way they see it, what they are aware of or what they aren't aware of.
It's a great recommendation, and appreciate the reminder that as you phrase it, the story of you isn't about you. And again, that gets back, I think, specifically to our higher ed environment, where again we have so much to say about our institutions, and we want to emphasize all of those great things. So it can be easy to fall into the trap of not thinking about our audience and their specific needs and their worldview and their frame of mind. So a great exercise to get us thinking that way.
Thank you. And there are many more in the book.
Just a quick reminder, if anyone has questions or comments for Esther about storytelling, please jump in on the discussion and tweet us using the hashtag higheredlive.com or higheredlive. And I want to move on to a tougher one, perhaps, or at least tougher for me, and that is telling stories with data. And we're certainly inundated with data, inundated with information. So how can we effectively use data to tell stories instead of just doing a data dump on our audience? How do we use data to our advantage?
Remember, first thing is that most people can't hold more than 7 numbers in their head at a time in their working memory, plus or minus 3, right? No more than 7 on average, plus or minus 3. And so that is at the most 4. That is at the 4 to 10 that people can hold in their working memories. And that's, my goodness, that's terrible news, because we have a lot more numbers than 4 to 10. So what do you do with that? I would say that think about just one number, but 3 times. Okay, ready? It's 10, 10, and 10. That's it. Okay, what are they? I mentioned the importance of ending. How would you like to end? How you plan to end the stories? And so ask yourself these questions when you have a lot of data to share. And that is, take this assumption. I can put a public challenge. Anyone who disagree, actually, that pretty soon after your data presentations, most people is going to forget most everything. Okay. It's not encouraging news because, oh my gosh, it takes time and effort and money to collect data and to analyze them and then to put them in a receptive format in a presentations. And then I'm telling you they'll forget pretty much everything afterwards. Yes, that's pretty much how it is. But the good news is you get to keep 3 things, 3 very specific things. But you have to say that with 10 words or fewer per thing. What is it? Okay. So once you try that exercise, right, before you go out and present your data, that is going to put on effectively a good filter for yourself. Again, another way to put yourself in the audience shoes. They'll forget everything, but they get to keep 3 things. What would those be? Once you have that, then you look at your own presentation differently. And then you'll have a pair of very sharp scissors to help yourself trim, rearrange, and sequence the data in ways that they will remember.
One other thing that I found helpful was your point that we need to understand the difference between proving and persuading, and gets back to knowing what our purpose of story, what our purpose of the presentation is, and I thought that was a helpful thing. It's not necessarily one or the other, but how do you use both effectively?
Yeah, and I would say that in higher ed, especially those of us who love higher ed, we're almost too well trained, right, to prove our points. Because number one, you got to prove that you didn't cheat, right, when you did your exam. So prove your points. And number two, if you get the wrong final answers, you get partial credits. Right, so this habit for a lot of people never leave us. It's, I got to prove it to you. But we forget that by the time we actually get to be in front of our audience, we already have some credibility. We've already proven that we deserve to be here. Now we need to persuade, right? Persuading involves acknowledging what your audience is thinking about, is worrying about, what's important to them, what are their pain points. Even if they know it, right? And that's why that the exercise that I designed for my book tour was so, I think it's very popular because it gives people a chance to feel acknowledged. Nothing new about themselves they necessarily uncovered, but it's an incredible, powerful, persuasive tool when you hear your own worries or your own thoughts uttered through another human's voice, right? So persuading, first and foremost, start with an acknowledgement that is relevant in the presentation or the story. And then persuasion also had something to do with, well, what you got for me, right? I have this worry, I have this pain points. How do I solve it? How do I change? How do I improve? That's a great opportunity then to say, well, here's why you should come to Indiana University, right? And then also what we neglect to pinpoint, and I think For better or worse, the skillful politicians are really good at it than the rest of us. And that is, they have a picture, a future picture in mind, right? That they promise that they'll take us there. But we often neglect to include at the end is something that we aspire to, that we can all aspire to together.
Yeah, that's great. And I appreciate the various examples that apply directly to higher ed. And I know you've worked with nonprofit organizations, and interested if you have any other specific advice, Esther, for higher ed specifically, or even more broadly speaking, the nonprofit sector, those types of organizations, and perhaps even if there's a specific example of a nonprofit organization that you admire or you have seen or worked with that really excels when it comes to their storytelling.
Yeah, let me answer that in two parts. The first part actually doesn't have anything to do with higher ed or nonprofit, but is an example that transcends across industry. And that is, I had a opportunity to have a conversation with the former chief marketing officers at United. His name is Tom O'Toole. He's now currently on faculty with Kellogg. And I was writing my book at the time, and I wanted to run a model by him and just make sure that I'm on the right path before I put it on the manuscript. And so imagine you're the CMO of a major global airline, and imagine the sheer volume of presentations and the stories and the ideas and the research that people had to report to you, right? So it's a daunting undertaking. And so when I told him that, I think the best way to get people's attention, to get people to care, is talk about the why and the what first, and then save the how in the middle. And I couldn't get to even the rest of my motto, and I noticed that he had a smirk on his face. And then he interrupted me. I'm glad he did. And he said, well, coincidentally, whenever I sit into a presentation, I always ask before the presentation begins, why should I care? And what do you want me to do about it? So that's an example that I want to transcend, that I want to share, because it transcends higher ed, nonprofit, for-profit, private, public sector. Is this whatever messaging that we're putting out there, stories, presentation, data, is to think about, why should people care? And if they do, assuming that if and when they do, what should they do about it? Okay, and I want to loop back to the second part of my answers is had to do with emissions. Why a lot of people ask, do you remember any stories, any essays that really stood out? And I'll be honest, not a whole lot. And then also, this is, 15 years ago, but there's one in particular I still remember till today. Because in the essays where we ask, why do you want to come to Booth, and why now, why MBA, and all of that, this particular applicant started with her family dinner. And we thought, okay, business school, top tier business school, MBA program, you want to talk about your family dinner? But she quickly went into how she and her two siblings not only have to be ready when dinner comes. Her two working parents really emphasize the family time, but they grill them on current affairs, right? So they can't just chomp down food and then left the table. They have to be ready for the conversations. And then their parents also make them debate with each other. And then she told us in her essays, as I was sitting in class during my campus visit, as I was watching and observing faculty and students interacting, all of a sudden I felt like I was back home eating dinner with my family.
Wow.
How can we say no, in addition to her being very highly qualified and saying that? And of course, we offer her admissions because this is a way to illustrate character, to illustrate fit, right? To show us that we care about her story, and then to get us to offer her admissions.
What an awesome example. What an awesome story. One other thing that I want to be sure that we get to and touch on, and I noticed, Esther, that you effectively incorporated it into some of your comments, is the use of visuals. And I noticed that you didn't, we didn't toggle over to your computer screen in a fancy graphic or anything like that, pen and pad, and it really helped emphasize your point. So you talk in the book about the use of visuals and their effectiveness. And so advice that you would have as we're presenting, as we're in a meeting, as we're trying to incorporate story, how we should think about incorporating visuals or using visuals, and especially knowing that this is we live in a visual world, and visuals drive a lot of the conversation online. Help us think about visuals.
Sure. One of my favorite topics. I'm so glad you bring it up. First thing is, you don't have to spend a whole lot of money on effective visuals. In fact, you don't have to spend any money. This costs no money. So that's one thing. Two is, in any presentation, according to my colleague and professor, Steve Frankenary, in any meeting, whoever throws out the visual first tends to dominate the conversation. Okay. And third is to remember that although we have 5 senses, right? Hearing, tasting, smelling, and touching, and 5 senses. Visuals, our sight, visuals consumes up to 40 to 50% of our brain power. Right. That is why when there's a saying that a picture's worth 1,000 words, and that is why also what we see tends to influence what we hear. Right. So this kind of storytelling we're talking about is verbal, right? It's written, it's presentation, but people consume it with their ears. But if you throw out an effective visuals, it influenced the way we hear and we listen. And the reason why you don't have to spend a whole lot of money or any money at all is that if you use the 6 effective visual in your presentation, in your marketing, that you achieve the goal without actually spending much of any money, because it only complement, enhance, and subtly help you control the conversations without anybody noticing that you are influencing, controlling the conversation.
You've given us so many great practical tips and suggestions and recommendations that I think will be super helpful going forward, and has been intriguing. And as we wrap up, anything else for a marketer or communications person in higher ed who walks away from this discussion and thinks about or reflects on how can I individually, personally become a better storyteller? And what would be those 1, 2, 3 things that you might advise?
Sure. I think the first thing is to know when to intrigue and when to data them. We need both, but it's knowing when to do what. It's going to distinguish and really differentiate ourselves. The second thing is being able to be endlessly curious and respectful at the same time. I can't tell you how powerful that can be. And I'll just quickly end with a story that I included in the book. And that is many years ago, my husband and I went to Italy for a vacation before we had kids. And neither of us speak any Italian. And we're in Milan, we're wandering in the neighborhood. We started taking pictures of this particularly really stately looking building, but that looks like it's an office. It looks like a castle, but it looks like an office at the same time. So Saturday afternoon, we didn't expect anybody to be even around. And then someone walked out of the gate. You know, looked like an elderly man and in suits. And then he saw us taking pictures, and then he started talking to us. His English is okay, and our Italian is non-existent. But then we were curious. So with hands and feet, somehow we were able to start it off with a small talk about the building. And then before we knew it, he asked if we would be interested in looking at the courtyard. And then we didn't know anyone there. We're no friends there. And someone just offered, you want to come in and take a look? So of course we said, oh yeah, we'll take a look. So he took us in, walked us through the courtyard, gave us a bit more history. We asked more questions. And then he said, oh, do you want to take a look at my office? And we thought, yes, of course. And so he showed us his office. He turned out to be a lawyer. He's in his early 80s, still working on a Saturday afternoon on a case. And then I noticed in his office at the corner, there's a black and white photo. I couldn't quite make out of what it was. It's just right at his desk. There's no frame. But in the black and white photo, there was this cloth that looks to be rolling on the ground with a few people in military uniform. So I asked, what is that? And he said, oh, my comrade, my best friend, was amongst one of the deads in that group that they were covered in cloth. It was during World War II. And that was the last memory that I had of him. And we walked away. We thanked him. We walked away. We were stunned from not knowing Italian, not knowing anybody there. But then when we show curiosity and respect, people tend to open up. They invite you in and they show you around. And I think it's that mindset, that attitude that you take with us, that we take with us as marketers, that would really allow our audience to open up and invite us in and show us around, and that we can really create a meaningful connections.
That's such a great point. And as I think about and in my head, summarize all the things that you've shared and think about even my own takeaways or next steps. And one reminder for me is, again, the strategic nature of storytelling with all of that in mind and all that you shared is I need to practice. I need to be a better storyteller. I need to do more of it and practice and think through some of these things, because to be a good storyteller, you have to become a better storyteller. So that's helpful to me as well.
Yep. So we believe the book is very helpful to that goal, to practice. You don't need to be creative. You don't need to be a natural born storyteller. You need to practice, and you follow a process that will save you time because it's deliberate practice, not just random practice. And if there's any way that I can coach and help train, teams and, speaking on a particular storytelling topic, again, this is homecoming for me. I care about higher ed a great deal. I would love to be able to be helpful in that regard as well.
Great. Well, thank you, Esther. This has been terrific. So thank you again for the discussion, and thanks so much for all the insights today.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been a blast.
And as always, thank you to Instoner for making Marketing Live possible. Thanks as well to Omni Update. Be sure to get reminders about this and other episodes by subscribing to the Higher Ed Live newsletter. You can browse the video archives at higheredlive.com or subscribe to the podcast. I'm Rob Zinkin. Thanks again for tuning in to Marketing Live on the Higher Ed Live Network.